Let's now talk about the Emperor Heraclius, who ruled the Byzantine world between 610 and 641. Heraclius in the modern world is the beneficiary of a great deal of hero worship. Both laymen and scholars of things Byzantine tend to really look at Heraclius as an untarnished hero, sort of this figure who stood in the wind and stood up against impossible odds time and again and saved the Byzantine Empire from certain destruction. What I would like to do in this video is to tell the story of Heraclius' life in detail, but also to challenge the hero worship that surrounds Heraclius. Now, I think that his good deeds massively outweigh his bad deeds, but I think that it is important to look at what he did and ask critical questions of it. There are some things in his life that he did that were questionable, and some decisions that he made that are a bit puzzling. And I think that we can learn quite a bit more about both Heraclius and his empire by asking those questions. So without any further ado, let's look at one of Byzantium's best known and best well-remembered emperors. Let's take a look at the origins of Heraclius. He was born sometime between 575 and 580. His father was also named Heraclius, and he was the Exarch of Africa. This elder Heraclius owed his appointment to the Emperor Maurice, who reigned between 582 and 602. Heraclius had a couple of relatives who will play a role later in our story. He had a younger cousin named Nicetas, who would prove to be a key supporter of his early on, and Heraclius also had a brother named Theodore, who would be one of his best commanders in the long struggle against the Persians. By the time 610 rolled around and Heraclius assumed the throne, he would have been in his prime, about 30 to 35 years old, and he was someone who appeared to be physically vigorous and exceptionally handsome. So how did Heraclius find himself in a position to become emperor? Well, to really answer that question, we need to rewind the clock to 602. Maurice was overthrown by the Emperor Phocas in a military coup. Now, Maurice was significant for establishing the precedent of the Byzantine soldier emperor. This means that now people are looking for an emperor who will be a chief general as well, someone who can demonstrate military competence and some degree of personal leadership. Now, despite the fact that the Balkan armies had been disaffected in 602 and had murdered Maurice for ordering them to winter north of the Danube away from their more comfortable forts, most officials and armies in the empire had been loyal to Maurice and were sad to see him go, which means that there's an undercurrent of discontent, especially once Phocas starts to have other problems. Of all of the powerful governors throughout the empire, the elder Heraclius was in one of the better positions. He held a senior office. He was a semi-independent governor out in Africa, which was far removed from Constantinople. And as someone who was really senior and well-respected, he could take up the mantle of Maurice, and it wouldn't be seen as a downgrade necessarily from what Maurice had brought to the table. But ultimately, of course, the elder Heraclius will not become emperor. That task will fall to his son. So Phocas also had another problem that was Maurice related. You can't just get rid of someone who has a bunch of ties to a bunch of other people and expect everything to be peachy keen. Earlier in his reign, Maurice had restored Chosroe II to the Sasanian throne, and therefore there was a relationship between Maurice and Chosroe II. Now, when he heard that his former benefactor Maurice had died, Chosroe II decided to capitalize on the occasion. Now, granted, this relationship was not really all that warm. Maurice had taken some land for his trouble in restoring Chosroe II, and Chosroe probably wanted that land back. So he declared war in 602, ostensibly to avenge his benefactor Maurice, but in reality to try to reclaim some land and extract some concessions from Phocas. For whatever reason, Phocas either didn't offer to make concessions and end the war early, or Chosroe was not interested in taking chump change. Chosroe also used some leverage by holding a Byzantine boy with him named Theodosius, and he claimed that this boy was Maurice's eldest son, Theodosius, who was a teenager. And he said that he would do for Maurice's son what Maurice had done for him, and he promoted the rights of this boy to rule the empire. Now, partly due to the propaganda of Phocas and Heraclius, all the sources pretty much agree that this was not the real Theodosius. Whether it was or not is hard to say, and we don't really know exactly the exact itineraries of all of Maurice's sons at the time of their, the time of Phocas's coup in 602. At any rate, many Byzantine forces did refuse to fight Maurice's heir and defected to the Persians who were fighting in the name of Theodosius, which meant that the frontier was beginning to crack as whole cities and armies would turn themselves over to Chosroe II. So by 608, it was clear that Phocas was vulnerable and that discontent among the Byzantines was growing and spreading. So that year, the Heraclii broke away from Phocas formally, and there was a coin minted in Carthage where both father and son appeared in the consular regalia side by side. By detaching Africa from the rest of the empire, the Heraclii already controlled one of the empire's two biggest sources of grain. And the best way to really put pressure on Phocas, who had a large city in Constantinople to feed, was to take out the other major source of grain, Egypt. So Heraclius' cousin Nicetas led an overland invasion of Egypt and eventually was able to overcome Phocas' governor there by 609. In the meantime, the younger Heraclius led a fleet via Sicily and Cyprus to Constantinople. This seems to have been a fairly leisurely trip, and in the process he negotiated with Priscus, who was both the head of the excubators, the bodyguard of the emperor, and Phocas' son-in-law. And they managed to come to an agreement whereby Priscus would support Heraclius' bid for power and betray his father-in-law. So when Heraclius' ships arrived in the harbor in autumn of 610, he was able to take the city without a struggle, and Phocas was duly arrested and deposed. For the first few days that he was in Constantinople, it appears that Heraclius did not stir from his ship, and he waited for Phocas to be brought to him. When Phocas was brought and thrown before his feet, Heraclius demanded of him, "Is this how you have ruled, wretch?" Mocking, how Phocas had come to this end and been betrayed by everybody around him. And Phocas had retorted, "And will you rule better?" Which, in retrospect, was a good question. We'll see that before Heraclius became the great hero emperor, he had a long period of struggle to get through. Heraclius wasn't having any of that shit, and he pulled out his sword and beheaded Phocas on the spot. That's pretty rare for an emperor to actually kill someone with their own blade. And later he will order that Phocas' genitalia be removed because he had heard a story that Phocas had raped a noblewoman and he wanted to avenge her honor. So the first major dilemma that we encounter is whether or not Heraclius was justified in seizing power in 610 in the midst of a major conflict with the Persians. In the traditional view of most scholars, Heraclius saved Byzantium from Phocas' tyranny and incompetence, and it was good for the empire that he did what he did when he did it. However, the fact is, the worst disasters of the war all came after Heraclius had been in power, and most of them came within about 2 or 3 years of him taking power, so they were pretty firmly on his watch. Another factor to consider is that Phocas had had to divert forces from his eastern frontiers to try to defend his breadbasket in Egypt and his capital from Heraclius' approaching forces. He also may have had to weaken the Balkans even further in order to do that. So it's possible that Heraclius was actually the major driver of the Byzantine collapse, by diverting the empire's resources into a civil war at a time when they were clearly losing the war on the main front against the Persians. One of the most debated things about Heraclius' reign is what he did between 610 and 622. Now, as we'll find out, most of the major defeats that the Byzantines suffered at the hands of the Persians occurred during this period, and by 622 the situation was desperate and it looked like the Byzantine Empire was on the verge of falling and being completely conquered by the Sasanian Persians. So in October of 610, shortly after he had dealt with Phocas, Heraclius married his first wife, who then took the name Eudokia, and they celebrated their coronation together. Now, around that same time, by 610, the Persians had conquered all of Mesopotamia and the Caucasus, and then they began to push further, meaning that they were now penetrating more deeply than they had at any point in previous history, at least at the expense of the Byzantines. So, in 612, Eudokia died. She had already given birth to Heraclius' son Constantine III, though. And in 613, Heraclius decided to remarry, and his choice of bride was somewhat controversial. He married his niece Martina, and this horrified many people in Constantinople, and this would be something that would be thrown in his face repeatedly, even as we'll see by some of his relatives, as being impious. And in fact, many of the children that imperial couple would end up being have developmental disabilities and not be viable as rulers. So it appears that Heraclius was building his legitimacy in Constantinople itself by making public appearances and siring offspring. Now, we should not allow the fact that he accomplished so much to blind us to the other fact that he came to power as a usurper. He was not someone who inherited the throne. He wasn't chosen. He wasn't beckoned by, a desperate people or a Senate decree or anything like that. He is someone who took advantage of the weakness of another emperor and arrived with his forces and took power. And that's really reflected in the fact that he spent so much time really establishing himself and establishing his line in Constantinople itself. So right after Heraclius has taken power, this is when the Byzantine position in the east begins to collapse in earnest. It's already pretty bad. They've already lost significant swaths of territory, but now it's a full-on meltdown. And Heraclius decides to place the blame on Priscus. If you remember, Priscus is the guy who was the son-in-law of Phocas and had betrayed his father-in-law to Heraclius. In return, Heraclius had made him one of his major field commanders. And Priscus at one point had a Persian army trapped, but he hadn't had enough initiative to follow up and destroy that army, which would have then relieved pressure quite a bit and enabled the Byzantines to re-enter Mesopotamia. Because of Priscus's failure, Heraclius decides to pin the blame on him and then forced him to take monastic vows. So at that point, he had rid himself of a potential rival, but he had been deprived of a military victory due to Priscus's failure. Now, it's possible that Priscus actually hadn't been in quite as good of a position as Heraclius seems to have thought, but at any rate, Heraclius did manage to rid himself of a potential problem. A little after Priscus was removed, the Persians managed to make a breakthrough at the city of Caesarea, and that breakthrough exposed the Anatolian heartland of the Byzantine realm. Now, I say heartland in light of what happens later in Byzantine history when Anatolia will become the real heartland. At this point, though, they hadn't lost enough territory for an extended enough period of time that they looked upon any part of their territory as being their fallback position, if you will. So I am being a little bit out of chronological sequence by making that observation, but bear with me. It was also around the time of this great Byzantine collapse that Persia's greatest general during this extended war from 602 to 628 really made his name. And that man is Shar-Baraz, who earned the nickname the Royal Boar of Persia. he will be the greatest Sasanian field commander in the war, and it's not really close. In 611, he captured the city of Antioch. Now, unless things had changed in the last 100 or so years, Antioch was about the third largest city in the east, so its loss was pretty big. In 613, he managed to capture the city of Damascus, which was a major center in Syria. And then he managed to capture Caesarea, and that was the event which opened up Asia Minor to attack. So now at this point, the eastern provinces are deeply penetrated, and they're on the verge of a complete and total collapse when it comes to Byzantine authority and prestige. And one thing to note about exactly why that's as bad or worse than it sounds is that you have to control a certain amount of revenue to keep your armies in the field. So the more territory you don't have, the harder it is to make a comeback. So this Sharbaraz is going to be a thorn in Heraclius' side for most of his career. And if I had to pick any single person to be sort of the great bad guy or the great opposition figure for Heraclius, it would be Sharbaraz. One of the major events in the war, at least in terms of its resonance in the sources, is the fall of Jerusalem in 614 to the forces of Sharbaraz. Now, I'd like to offer as a caveat the fact that this victory was actually strategically far less important than Sharbaraz's victories at Antioch, Caesarea, or Damascus. All three of those cities were much more important strategically for the Byzantines. Jerusalem, because of its location, doesn't even help to defend Egypt from being invaded by a force from Mesopotamia. So it's pretty much a city that is only useful in its own sake and for its symbolic value. The Persians took the city after a month-long siege, and then they placed the Jewish community of the city in charge. It also appears that the Jewish community, for the most part, would side with the Persians during this conflict. Or at least that's what the Christian sources later would claim, and maybe that was just one way of trying to explain away their own failure, is by blaming the Jews. But who's to say, maybe it is true that the Jewish forces did favor the Persians because they were kinder to them in some way. At any rate, the true cross was something that was being held at Jerusalem, and that was taken away to Ctesiphon as a trophy of war. After all, this is one of the holiest symbols in your enemy's religion, and capturing it sort of has this great symbolic and propaganda value. Now, this would spur anti-Jewish sentiments in Constantinople, since the story, as it was told there, was that the Jews of Jerusalem had really betrayed the city and were now going to oppress all the Christians. So Heraclius, who had just remarried to his niece the year before, was now accused of impiety, and this may have been the low point of his personal reputation. Some people were suggesting in no uncertain terms that Jerusalem had fallen and the true cross had been lost because God was angry at Heraclius and his empire for allowing their emperor to marry his own niece. But at any rate, he will remain married to his niece for the rest of his life, and he will eventually reclaim Jerusalem. Spoilers, I'm sorry, but look at history. There aren't really too many surprises, are there? At the same time that his positions in the east are falling like dominoes, the Balkans also becomes a major problem for Heraclius. So, to really man all those armies out east, Heraclius and his predecessor Phocas had to remove many of the field units from service in the Balkans. The problem is that left the Danubian frontier open. Now, around 602 or so, the Balkan tribes like the Avars and the various Slavic groups were fairly battered at the hands of Maurice, so it took them a while to be able to take advantage of Byzantine weakness in the region. And at some point early in Heraclius' reign, it's not really clear exactly when, the Avars and Slavs and Bulgars and all the other groups in that region moved into the Balkans in force and really occupied the majority of the Balkans, including a large percentage of Greece itself. And if you talk about anything like Mysia or Dalmatia or Macedonia, it's a total occupation, more or less. The only things that really survived with any degree of regularity were large walled cities and coastal settlements, which could be supported by the Byzantine fleet. So Heraclius tried to make peace with the Avar Kagan in 617 or 619. Both dates are given at various times. And the Avar Kagan was the greatest leader of the Avars to ever emerge. All these rulers had the title Kagan. We don't know this guy's actual name, so he's just always referred to as the Kagan. And apparently what happened is the Kagan just wanted to set a big trap for Heraclius and then probably try to ransom him. But Heraclius was wise to the scheme and managed to escape just in the nick of time. By 620 or so, nearly everything in the Balkans was effectively overrun. The only thing that will make the situation manageable for the Byzantines is that most of the Slavs who came into the Balkans were more interested in settling down and engaging in agriculture than they were in pillaging and serving as soldiers under the Avar ruler. However, it will take them a little while to come to that conclusion, and in the meantime, they will provide probably the majority of the manpower for the Avar coalition army. So by 618 or 19, Heraclius was not even able to avenge himself against the Avars, and his empire was in tatters. His armies were defeated on all fronts, he had lost a lot of territory, and he probably didn't really have any reliable or go-to commanders at that point. So around that time, he decided to send envoys to negotiate a peace with Chosroe II. And in that peace agreement, Heraclius was willing to cede Palestine and Syria to the Persians, which was a major concession because those were very important provinces for the Byzantines in terms of the revenue that they generated. And in the case of Palestine, it contains what the Byzantines considered to be their holy city, Jerusalem. So this was a massive offer which would have destroyed Heraclius' credibility to a great degree. It's possible, though, that what he was doing was trying to buy time so that way he could come back and reclaim that territory when he was ready. And maybe that's actually what Chosroe saw through, and Chosroe didn't want to stop the war at a time when he was winning and allow his enemy to regroup, so he rejected the peace offer and had the envoys imprisoned and starved, and then began his invasion of Egypt, and also told his other armies to keep pressing against the Byzantine defenses. The loss of Antioch in 611 had been a major blow to the empire, and then the loss of Caesarea had really opened up the empire in ways that were pretty unpleasant, but neither of those defeats quite equaled the fall of Alexandria in 619, and with it the loss of control of Egypt. The important thing about Egypt is that it produced a massive amount of revenue and food for the Byzantine Empire. And without Egypt, it was impossible to keep Constantinople fed. The city of Constantinople would have had around 1 million people about this time. So we can guess that the depopulation of Constantinople and its descent from being the world's premier city would have happened under either Heraclius or his son, grandson, Constans II. So this was a major blow, and this would have really brought home the cost of war to all of the empire's subjects. This would be the ultimate hammer blow. And of course, Heraclius was as aware of anyone of the value of Egypt, since he had taken Egypt from Phocas before doing anything else. So this was the largest single blow that the Byzantines would suffer throughout the entire war. So from 619 to 622, Chosroe and his generals continued to win victory after victory. By that point, they had overrun most of Anatolia. They also had a path all the way to Chalcedon, just across the straits from Constantinople itself. They had overrun Egypt and Syria. So this, 622 marks the high tide for Persia in this conflict. At the same time, of course, as we mentioned, the Balkans were overrun as well. So the Byzantine Empire was pretty much at a low ebb, and if you were to color it in on a map, it would look a lot like the Byzantine Empire in its late phases, say around the 1300s. At this point, Heraclius' holdings were limited to Constantinople, the Greek islands and the Aegean, and then some coastal cities in the Balkans. He didn't really have much to work with, and things were about as dire as they could possibly be. So that meant that it was time for Heraclius to try something different, and that's exactly what he ended up doing. As the old cliche goes, desperate times call for desperate measures. In 616, Heraclius had been so hard pressed financially that he had had to cut the pay of all of his soldiers and bureaucrats in half. And that also explains why he spent so much time in the capital, so that way there wouldn't be a revolt against him. Usually, when you cut the pay of the soldiers, they were deeply unhappy and would back any general who was willing to promise to restore it. At one point, Heraclius also came up with the idea of abandoning Constantinople and then regrouping at Carthage for a reconquest of the East. But when word of that got out, the populace was outraged, and so was the patriarch, and eventually Heraclius was dissuaded from this plan. But he was still determined to engage in bold action because he knew that what he had been doing was completely ineffective. So in the summer of 622, Heraclius led his field army that he had gathered at the capital, and he took it by sea to Cilicia. Actually, one thing that he still had going for him was naval superiority, because the Persians had not built a navy, and we'll see that the Slavs and Avars don't really have access to much in the way of a navy. So although this navy's probably not well kept at this point because of all of the revenue problems, it's still better than what it is not facing on the seas. So he landed not far from the Bay of Isis, where Alexander had been at one point in his campaign, and Heraclius spent the majority of the summer drilling his men and getting them ready for battle. As the autumn of 622 approached, Heraclius then marched north through Asia Minor, and he made his way to the region of Pontus on the north coast of Anatolia, facing the Black Sea. On his way, he passed through Cappadocia, and he met the army of Sharbaraz in battle. And during this battle, he actually managed to defeat Sharbaraz and rout his army completely. Then he resumed his march north, and he left his army at the city of Trebizond, pictured here, and then returned to the capital in order to deal with a renewed Avar threat for the winter. This Pontus region, especially the city of Trebizond itself, was going to be his main base of operations for the rest of the war. So this is why I call it the Northern Strategy. At this point, he sees that this area is accessible by sea from his capital, and because of its rugged terrain, it's more easily defensible than most other points of his empire. So it's something that will favor his more infantry-based army, and it will sort of negate some of the advantages that the Persians have. So this will be the strategy that he ultimately banks on for winning eventual victory. So for the campaign of 623, Heraclius was joined by his wife Martina. She probably wanted to leave the capital to avoid getting leered at by people who accused her of incest. And she gave birth that year to yet another child. And I believe, I could be off on this a little bit, but I believe the child who was born that year was Heraclius. Maybe he wasn't born quite yet, but at any rate, it was sometime during this campaign that Heraclius would be born. Heraclius crossed over the Persian frontier from this northern base and struck into what is now Azerbaijan, and he was hunting for Chosroe himself. Now, Chosroe was in the region and he had troops, but he did not want to face the emperor in battle, so he ended up fleeing all the way to Nineveh in Mesopotamia. And basically, Heraclius was looking for the relics taken from Jerusalem, and he ended up burning down a Zoroastrian temple in the region out of frustration when he didn't find it. He also engaged in gospel divination, where he told his men that they were all going to fast for 4 days, and then he'd open up the Bible to a random passage, and that passage would be a sign from God. It looks like this was beginning to take on some characteristics of a holy war. There are some people who even call Heraclius the first crusader. And if you look at how bad things had gotten for the Byzantines, it's very possible that Heraclius' way of motivating his men was to throw in a bunch of religious rhetoric and make this a battle for survival between the Christians and the so-called fire worshippers of the East. At any rate, he was in a position to menace Ctesiphon at one point, the capital of the Sasanian Empire, but then he retreated when Sharbaraz's army came into Mesopotamia and threatened to attack him from the flank if he were to try to make a siege of Ctesiphon. And because of that, he ended up retreating back to his base. The next year, Heraclius made an alliance with the Khazars, and then he invaded Armenia. So the entirety of the 624 campaign, or at least the parts that are recorded in the sources, all occur in Armenia. This was a traditional battleground between the two empires. It's a little bit of an odd choice considering how much of the Byzantine Empire was currently under Persian occupation, that Heraclius would be trying to reassert his authority in what had previously been a satellite state and something that controls access to his empire if you're coming from the east. At any rate, Heraclius in Armenia met with quite a bit of success on the battlefield. He was able to defeat an army commanded by Sharbaraz and a colleague. That colleague was killed in battle. And then a third army arrived late under General Shaheen, and Heraclius was able to defeat that army as well. Now, during this time, the Byzantines were not able to really follow up much beyond that, and Heraclius would spend the winter on Lake Van, and that would conclude the campaign of 624. So, pretty good year, but he had won a region which wasn't necessarily the most important, and it also wasn't something that had restored his power to what it needed to be. In 623, Heraclius had fought on Persian soil, and then in 624 he had fought on the contested ground of Armenia, and it was only in 625 when his invasions took him to lands that had been under Byzantine control prior to the outbreak of the war. So he invaded the portion of Mesopotamia that had belonged to the Romans, capturing Amida and Martyropolis unopposed. Presumably the Persians had not put garrisons in place, and Heraclius had drawn their attention further to the east, and he was able to sneak in and capture these key positions unopposed. So that by itself makes this campaign a success. However, as he was chasing Sharbaraz's army in the region, he was lured into a river crossing battle. So his vanguard had already crossed the bridge, and then the bridge was destroyed, and Sharbaraz destroyed Heraclius' vanguard. Well, Heraclius was trapped then, so instead of trying to escape and risk being pursued without a lot of his best scouting troops, Heraclius decided to confront Sharbaraz head-on and charge across the river into his ranks. And surprisingly, this worked. Now, usually charging against an enemy on the far side of a river is a terrible idea and normally results in defeat, but Heraclius managed to win the battle because he led his men in person and inspired them, and was even able to absorb a few hits and keep going. Sharbaraz was amazed by Heraclius' valor and said something to the effect that Heraclius doesn't fear arrows any more than an anvil would, which I suppose was supposed to be high praise, since it's basically saying that Heraclius was a badass. Anyway, both armies retreated to winter quarters, and because of the context of the battle where the vanguard got smashed and then Heraclius charged into the face of a bunch of archers on the opposite bank, pretty safe to say that both sides suffered some fairly severe casualties, and that would explain a lot about what Heraclius does in the next year, 626. Going into 626, it appears that Chosroe had ordered Sharbaraz to go back to Asia Minor and try to assist the Avar Khagan in a siege of Constantinople. How Heraclius became aware of these plans is not clear, but at some time he seems to have had foreknowledge of this, probably by intercepting a letter or through a spy or something of that nature, and accordingly he made his dispositions. So he split his forces into three parts. One of these portions would reinforce the garrison at Constantinople to make sure that this Avar and Persian force would not be able to capture the city. And a second army was sent out under Theodore to fight in Mesopotamia and probably defend the possessions that he had taken the year before, also to deal with the army under Shaheen. The third and smallest force would remain under Heraclius himself, and this force would be in the north around Armenia and the Caucasus, awaiting developments, or in the event, negotiating with the Khazars. The all-important defense of Constantinople was entrusted to the patrician Bonus, and Patriarch Sergius was also a major figure in that, although most likely his role was to keep up the population's morale rather than really making strategic decisions. So, the Avars and Slavs who assembled under the Kagan had siege engines and were about 80,000 or so in total, but they were unable to make any headway against the Theodosian walls and the 12,000 or so Byzantine defenders. In addition, the ranks of the Kagan's army began to fizzle fairly early due to the Kagan's demands, and he began to lose a lot of his popularity among the Slavic people who he wanted to be his subjects. On the Asian shore, Shah Baraz was not really in a position to do anything because he didn't have a fleet to convey his army over. So the Kagan ordered the Slavs to use their boats to transport the Persian army, but these boats were not really built for water combat, and for whatever reason the Byzantines were also aware of this development. Maybe they just had a good visibility from the towers on their city. At any rate, they were able to intercept and destroy all of the Slavic boats, and that really created a permanent separation between the Persians and the Avars, and that caused the grand plan of the Kagan to come unraveled. And after this siege, the Kagan's power will be broken, and his former subjects will begin breaking away from him in larger and larger numbers until the Avar Confederacy is reduced once again to being just another player rather than the dominant player in the Balkans. So while the Byzantine garrison at Constantinople was foiling the grand design of the Persians and Avars, Heraclius' brother Theodore was winning glory in his own right. So, in this same year of 626, Theodore and Shaheen met and fought a major battle. And for whatever reason, it was in the middle of a hailstorm which was blowing directly into the faces of the Persian army, and yet Shaheen launched a head-on attack and ended up receiving a heavy defeat. Now, it appears that Shaheen died soon after. It could have been as a result of his wounds from the battle, or it also could have been a suicide since the defeat was a very severe one. After Shaheen was dead, Chosroe II ordered that his body be preserved and then brought to his presence, where he had it disfigured. According to some people, this is the point when the Persians really began to lose faith in Chosroe and began to really suspect his mental health. Theodore, for whatever reason, was either unable or unwilling to follow up this great victory and exploit it too much, but in of itself, this was a major win for the Byzantines and would really set Heraclius up well to deliver a follow-up in due time. So from a strictly military standpoint, Heraclius himself didn't do all that much during 626, and he left it to his various subordinates to do the majority of the fighting. What he did do, though, was really important. He was in negotiations with the Khazar leader Zebul, and he created a deep alliance between their two peoples by offering his daughter's hand in marriage to the Khazar. So Zebul was duly impressed and agreed to this offer, and in exchange offered Heraclius the service of 40,000 of his men, which was a considerable force. Now, this marriage ends up not materializing because Zebul will die late in the year, and then his Khazars will begin to melt away. but the attempt is noteworthy, and it really shows that Heraclius was putting a lot of thought into how to win the war. Had Azebel lived and the alliance lasted longer, it's probable that Heraclius would have had a major advantage going into the campaign of 627. At any rate, he would have to go it without many Khazars. So early in 627, Heraclius resumed the field, and he led his army into Mesopotamia, making a beeline for Chosro's palace at Dastagerd, about 20 miles or so north of Ctesiphon. And although he arrived on the scene early in the year, he and a large Persian army under a new general named Rhazates would stalk each other for the entire year and not meet each other in a general engagement until December 12th of 627. And the place where they met was near the ancient city of Nineveh, so they would have fought within visual range of the ruins of that city. And the battle was closely fought, but ultimately it was decided, if the sources are to be believed, by the personal valor of Heraclius. Now, one reason I think he might have sat out 626 is because he was dealing with some injuries from that earlier battle against Sharbaraz, but now he has clearly recovered if he was ever hurt at all, and Heraclius was able to slay Rhazates in personal combat, and he was then able to slay two other Persian commanders in due turn. This ended up being the decisive battle of the war. Heraclius was able to defeat the main Persian field army in Mesopotamia near the heartland of the empire. And one advantage that the Byzantines had over the Persians is that Constantinople requires that you have a strong navy if you want to really effectively besiege it. Whereas Ctesiphon just happens to be another large city in Mesopotamia. So if you just have an army, you're probably fine if you want to try to take the city. So this means that now the tide has turned decisively, and Heraclius can threaten the center and heart of the Persian Empire, whereas it has been proven that the heart of his own empire was more or less impenetrable. Following the decisive battle at Nineveh, the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628 will drag on for another year, but it won't really feature any more major engagements. What will basically happen is that the Persians will begin to fall into disarray, and they will begin fighting over the throne, which will enable Heraclius to make peace with them, get what he wants, and get out of Dodge. So, what he does early on, this might have actually been even before the Battle of Nineveh, or possibly right after. Heraclius was able to sow some major dissent in their ranks by intercepting orders from the king to Sharbaraz, ordering him to bring his army back to Mesopotamia. And he changed those orders to tell Sharbaraz to stay in Asia Minor, and he gave false news of a major Persian victory. So Sharbaraz was fooled by these orders and stayed longer than he should have in the west. At the same time, Heraclius was then able to move on to Dastagerd and Ctesiphon, where he had an open path now that the army of Rhazates was dealt with. So anyway, Chosro II fled his palace and went south to Ctesiphon, but then he remembered a prophecy which said that if he were to enter the ancient capital of the Sasanians, that it would be the beginning of the end of his rule or something to that effect. So, frightened by that memory, he then fled to his eastern provinces out of the reach of Heraclius, and he began to work towards regrouping. And at that time, he also sent messages urging Ctesiphon to hold out. And also because Sharbaraz had not arrived on the scene yet, he accused him of treason, not knowing that Sharbaraz had received false orders. So at that point, there are plenty of Persian subjects and officials who are officially done with Chosro, and they're ready to make a change at the kingship position. And Sharbaraz will now be among them, since Chosro will more or less accuse him of treason and, suggest that he needs to be executed. So the unpopularity of Chosro II eventually led to his murder at the hand of his own son, Kavad II, in 628. Kavad II is then the person who agrees to make peace with Heraclius, and he agrees to restore all of the captured Byzantine lands in Syria and Palestine, Egypt, all those places, and also to repatriate all of the relics that were taken from Jerusalem. But then Kavad II will be overthrown in turn by his own son Ardashir III that same year in 628. But then Sharbaraz will take over from Ardashir III after 628. He'll do it in 630, and he'll establish his own dynasty, including printing this coin that you see on the screen. But then Sharbaraz will die that year too. So Persia is in all kinds of turmoil at this point, and it's not a great situation. But if you are Heraclius, it looks pretty cool because Persia is doing something other than ruining your life. So also, apparently the power structure in Persia was pretty bent out of shape by what had gone on. So when Heraclius' brother Theodore got the fragments of the True Cross back, he had to get them from Sharbaraz, who at this point was a general and not the Persian king. So the situation in Persia, to say the least, was pretty complicated, and it was something that really weakened them probably a lot more than their defeats at the hands of Heraclius. So, having made peace with the Persians and having recovered the True Cross, Heraclius returned to Constantinople and then celebrated a grand triumph where he had the True Cross, his victorious soldiers, and 4 Persian elephants, the likes of which had not been seen at Constantinople before. The Senate voted for Heraclius to receive the honorary name of Scipio, and it's pretty safe to say that this was the absolute peak of his career in terms of his popularity, glory, and power. Quite a few people have observed that had he simply died at around this time, or maybe a couple years later, that he would have gone down as the greatest emperor in Byzantine history, and that he would be regarded as something of a demigod. But as it is, he lived long enough to see all of his achievements undone, and probably his popularity took a big hit because of all that. So now let's look at the decline phase of Heraclius' career. So by the spring of 629, Heraclius was once again out of the capital, and he had returned to the east with Martina, and he was overseeing the return of the True Cross to Jerusalem and reordering his eastern provinces more generally. It's possible, if you are of the belief that Heraclius founded the thematic system, that he was laying the groundwork for it in his eastern provinces. However, I find the arguments in favor of Constans II as the author of the thematic system to be more compelling. At any rate, there was lots to be done in the east, and it looks like Heraclius was busy reconstructing the administration and army. There were still Persian garrisons evacuating from various parts of the Byzantine Empire, and every time that they would enter Persian territory, they would then fuel that ongoing civil war, which at this point was ridiculously complicated and long-lasting. Heraclius was able to travel for 7 years freely through his empire without a heavy escort, and that shows the kind of popularity and legitimacy that he enjoyed following his grand victory over the Persians. However, there was a major crisis about to break, and this one will be every bit as severe and trying as the Persian crisis. However, unfortunately for the empire, Heraclius was a shell of his former self by this time, and he was not up to the challenge the same way he had been in the past. In 632 in Arabia, the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, died, and he left behind him a unified state that was under the religion of Islam. And I think more importantly for the 7th century, it was a state which unified all of the Arabs. There were lots of Arabs around outside of Arabia. They had served as mercenaries in both of the major imperial armies during the Byzantine-Sasanian War, and many of them had also settled in various parts of both empires, especially along the frontiers. So because there was now a unified Arab state, that would be a dangerous opponent for the Byzantines, because they would be able to rally so much local support from soldiers who had served under the Byzantines and then retired and would live in places like Syria in fairly large numbers. So, another thing that the early Muslim community had going for it is that not only did it appeal to Arabs, but it also appealed to Bedouins. And because of the nature of Islamic doctrine, they promised religious toleration and low taxes for all people who were people of the book, which included Jews and Christians. And almost all of Rome's subjects in their eastern cities were either Jewish or Christian. So they didn't have much to fear when they surrendered to this new invading force. The Arabs had lots of military experience with the two empires. They knew a lot more about those two empires than either Byzantium or Persia knew about them. And the sort of X factor which really made the Arabs so successful is that they had far greater mobility, which included the ability to cross deserts in a way that a Byzantine or Sasanian army would never dream of. And they also produced an entire generation of really talented, experienced, and innovative commanders. We'll meet a couple of them, but by no means all of them, in the course of this video series. And between those factors, the Arab armies, when they started pouring out of Arabia in 633, would be virtually unstoppable. Although that was pretty hard to predict if you were sitting in Heraclius's seat at the time in 633. At the same time that the forces of a new religion were invading his empire, Heraclius was having trouble with members of his own faith at home. So the Christological debate in Byzantine history was passed from emperor to emperor, generation to generation, and despite some changes in it, it was something that seemed to never end. In 622, Sergius had come up with a way to try to circumvent that whole debate and come up with a way to focus on the energy of Christ and come up with a formula which would satisfy all sides of this whole debate. Well, Heraclius had thought that the solution was brilliant, so he had supported it, and he had done quite a bit to champion the views of Sergius to anyone who would listen. So for 12 years they've been building up support, and the obvious end game was to hold a church council where everyone would agree, and then the church would be completely reunited. There would be no more differences between the Orthodox and the Monophysites and Monothelites and all of these other labels that have very little actual meaning. At any rate, what happens in 634, though, as the Arab invasions are getting underway, is that Jerusalem gets a new bishop, and he is adamantly opposed to this solution. He has his own theological problems with it, and apparently his objections are strong enough that he single-handedly dismantles 12 years of progress on this issue by the patriarch who had defended the city from the Avars and the emperor who had he restored this Christian empire and defeated the Zoroastrians. So it's actually pretty incredible when you think about it, and you can understand why this would probably be a pretty shattering blow to Heraclius to see so much work go up in smoke at the same time that some of the cities that he had worked so hard to liberate from the Persians were now falling to this new foe from the south. To say that the Byzantines were surprised by how much difficulty they had with the Arabs would be a massive understatement. At some point before 633, an Arab raid had been turned back by the Byzantine forces. So shortly after the conclusion of the Byzantine-Sasanian War, when the Byzantine forces had probably not even been at full strength on the southern frontier of Palestine, they had still managed to turn back a raid. So when the raids became bigger, starting in 633, you can imagine how Byzantine authorities probably thought that they had the upper hand and that they would be able to deal with this. Arab raids have been going on for a very long time, and these new Muslim Arab raids didn't really seem to be all that different. The difference, though, is leadership, organization, and scale. And also remember, the Byzantines are weak as well. They have just come out of a major war, and most of their armies are probably being rebuilt, especially their local defense forces, and they're having to be rebuilt from scratch because their lands have been occupied for nearly a generation by the Persians. So, at any rate, in 634, this is when the Arab armies really arrive in force, and they quickly shatter the Byzantine forces in the Levant and manage to capture Damascus and Emesa while also beginning a siege of Jerusalem. So this was unexpected, but it wasn't exactly completely shattering, since the Byzantines had been through quite a lot of things that were worse than this, and they had overcome those in recent memory. One other aspect of this battle, though, is that the commander in the theater had been the Byzantine prince Theodore, Heraclius' younger brother, and he then blamed Heraclius' incest for these defeats. Heraclius was then angered and had him dismissed, and we don't hear any more of Theodore as a commander. Now, by this point in his life, Heraclius is too old to lead an army in person, but he is still vigorous enough to help organize an army, and he's able to raise about 80,000 men at Antioch and then send them out to repulse the Arab invasion. So when this new large army under Heraclius' generals arrives in Palestine, it meets with a few defeats in 635, but because it's such a large force, it does force the Arabs to abandon the cities that they had captured in the area. So it looked like the Byzantines were reestablishing control and everything was returning to normal, where the nomads from Arabia wouldn't really be able to pose a major threat. All they could do is raid and cause problems. Well, that all changed the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. Now, before this, the Arabs had managed to inflict a few pretty grievous defeats on the Persians, but at this point the Byzantines thought that the Persians were so weakened by the war that they probably didn't put too much stock into that. After all, they had managed to make a comeback against the Persians, and they knew that the Persians were fairly resilient, so they probably weren't thinking that the Arabs were doing anything extraordinary here. So at any rate, the two armies clashed in a 5-day battle between August 15th and August 20th of 636. And the Byzantines seem to have enjoyed a considerable numerical advantage, but the X factor here was the generalship of Khalid ibn al-Walid, who is one of, if not the greatest, Arab military leaders of all time. So, at various points in this long battle and on certain days, the Byzantines were holding their own. And there also was a point in the campaign before the battle was commenced where the Byzantines had a chance to strike early while some of the Arabs were in a vulnerable position, but they hadn't taken advantage. Anyway, even after bungling all their potential opportunities to deal early damage, the Byzantines were holding their own for the first 3 days of the battle, and it was only on day 4 where the Arabs really began to gain the upper hand. And then, from day 4 to day 5, that's when the battle went from being a contest of equals to just being a complete and total beating. The Byzantine army was completely shattered, and then at that point, not only was Palestine lost, but Syria then also became indefensible as well, since now the main field army was essentially gone. After Yarmouk, Heraclius concluded that the Near East was lost for the moment, and that the Byzantines had better retreat behind the protection of the Taurus Mountains. He also was dedicated to the defense of Egypt. So basically what he was doing was dividing his forces in half. Most of them would be holding the mountain passes of eastern Turkey, and the rest would be defending Egypt, which was flat and relatively hard to defend. As for Heraclius himself, he managed to get the True Cross removed from Jerusalem and then put aboard a ship, and then he himself returned to Constantinople in 638, although it was not without some weird incidents that we'll talk about. And that same year, in 638, the Bishop of Jerusalem, being surrounded by the enemy, was forced to surrender the city to the second Caliph Umar. and he actually ended up giving Umar a tour of the city and showing him all of the various Jewish and Christian holy sites that you could see there. By the time that he arrived on the eastern shore of the Bosporus, Heraclius was a man in physical, mental, and emotional decline. His health was falling apart, and he had also developed a real phobia of water. It got to the point where he refused to go on a boat, and therefore he ended up staying in his palace on the eastern side of the Bosporus for quite some time before he was escorted to the capital itself. Ultimately, Martina came up with a way to get him over by making a ship look like a forest or something, and then Heraclius was tricked into getting on board. At any rate, it seems like Heraclius, given the state of intelligence on the Arabs, was never fully aware that Islam was a fully realized independent religion and not just a subset of Judaism. So it looks like because so many Arabs in the past had been Jewish, Heraclius died seeing Islam as nothing more than just some new sect of Judaism that had cropped up and had, emerged out of Arabia. During his last 3 years or so, Heraclius leaned heavily on his sons Constantine III and Heraclius for making public appearances, especially Constantine III because he was a fully adult, even if his own health was also terrible. And this coin is of Heraclius with his 2 imperial sons. Now, in 639, shortly after he had returned to the capital, he received news that the Arab invasion of Egypt had begun, and by the time that he died in early 641, that invasion was not going well at all. So, as I mentioned earlier, the solution that Sergius had come up with in 622 had failed due to the Bishop of Jerusalem, who now was no longer even in Christian territory. But that did not stop Sergius from coming up with a new formula called the ekthesis, which was supposed to resolve the Monophysite issue. And so at first Heraclius jumps on board with this. Sergius, though, dies shortly after articulating this idea. And when the Pope expresses some reservations about this idea and says it's a complete disaster, Heraclius tried to pretend that he had never endorsed the ekthesis, and actually it's reported that that was what he was saying as he was literally dying. He was trying to deny something that everyone knew to be the case, that he had supported this idea. So, completely shattered and barely even a shell of his former self, Heraclius ended up dying mercifully at last on February 11th, 641. So now let's talk about Heraclius' legacy, and this part will probably be the hardest because there's so much to say that I will most likely miss a lot of important stuff. So one thing that Heraclius did that we haven't talked about is he made Greek the official language of imperial administration. Most of his officials were either native Greek speakers or else they knew the language well, whereas most of them were not all that conversant in Latin. So it really didn't make much sense to continue going along with the old standards that no longer applied. Now, his losing of the Balkans, I would argue, is something that was a major legacy of his reign and is definitely the biggest downside in the long run. The Balkans will be mostly lost to the Byzantines until about 800 or so, and that will leave all of his successors in a very tight spot when it comes to being able to recruit men and raise sufficient revenue to keep the state going. He also does establish the new eastern mountain frontier against the Islamic world. That frontier will hold for centuries, and it was a good strategic decision to retreat behind the Taurus Mountains. Heraclius would be proven right time and again in subsequent decades and centuries. One other thing that he did, which possibly ended up working against the interest of the empire in the long run, was contributing to the fatal weakening of Persia by sort of encouraging people like Sharbaraz to seek a claim to the throne. In the end, Persia being so weak meant that it folded up like an accordion when the Arabs hit, and without a strong Persia there to provide pushback, the Arabs were then able to dedicate more resources and men to fighting the Byzantines. So you could argue that Heraclius being so effective against the Persians actually ended up hurting him later when the Arabs arrived and the Persians weren't able to really pull their weight in terms of keeping those invasions in check. You could also say that Heraclius, in many ways, sort of invented the idea of Christian holy war. Now, some people try to make his wars out to be the beginning of the Crusades, but mostly those are people who have a ridiculous agenda trying to show that Europeans were not the aggressors in the Crusades, despite the fact that they traveled like hundreds or thousands of miles to wage a war. But somehow they're not the aggressors because of something that happened a few centuries before. It's kind of a ridiculous argument. However, if you're just looking at a Christian holy war and you're not considering it to be related to the Crusades, then you might have a point. Heraclius certainly relied very heavily on religious rhetoric to motivate his men. His men were facing some pretty drastic uphill odds, and they needed all the motivation they can get. So it makes sense why he would turn to religious rhetoric. And another part of his legacy that shouldn't be overlooked is the simple fact that he and his dynasty guided Byzantium through the turbulent 7th century, and they provided strong leadership even if the state itself was weak and at a low point in its history. Heraclius and then his grandson, great-grandson, and great-great-grandson would all really pull their weight and do what they could to keep the Byzantine Empire afloat. So I'd say that those are the major legacies of Heraclius. And pictured on your screen, of course, is his great-great-grandson, Justinian II, the emperor who lost his nose. But all of that is a different topic for a different day. For now, let's just remember Heraclius. Also, another thought about Heraclius that I had is, I mentioned it earlier, but there's this sort of idea that some people have had that Byzantine emperors, or the history of Byzantium as a whole, is sort of like this myth of Sisyphus, where they continue to push the boulder up the hill and then it'll fall down and they spend, a long time pushing it back up only for it to fall back down again. Heraclius is the ultimate example of that, since, he inherited an empire in trouble, things got worse, and then he restored it all, and then a new crisis arose and he ended basically where he had started. So that there's that, but also I'd like to revisit the idea that Heraclius simply lived too long. There was a story in Herodotus about the Athenian lawgiver Solon when he was traveling to Lydia and he visited King Croesus there. And he warned Croesus not to count himself happy until he had died, and had died under happy circumstances. Well, Croesus thought the advice was stupid, but ultimately it was proven correct. You could say similar things about Heraclius. Maybe after his grand triumph in Constantinople, if someone had asked him, he'd say that he was a very lucky man and that God was with him and had really looked out for him. But by 641, Heraclius was in terrible health, and his empire was falling apart all around him. His eldest son and intended heir was in terrible health. Everything had just fallen apart. So, anyhow, I think that this kind of these rapid shifts in fortune are part of what make Heraclius so interesting. And also, like, a lot of people talk about how he'd go down as an all-time great emperor had he simply died right after defeating Persia. I say you could make this a similar case for if he had died shortly after the Battle of Yarmouk, even. So yeah, there's a new crisis, but no one realistically expects this old emperor who's already done his part to resolve it. The fact that he was basically useless for 3 key years between 638 and 641, I think that was a major stain on his legacy, because that was a time that the Byzantines were really taking a pounding and needed a strong, vigorous leader to really keep them going. Now, he did set up the eastern frontier, but he wasn't really able to do anything effectively to protect his breadbasket in Egypt. So at this point, I'm probably just going to descend into pure rambling if I keep going. So I'll just end it here. This has been my video on the Emperor Heraclius. I hope you've enjoyed it, and be on the lookout in the near future for videos on Constans II and Constantine IV, which, because I've done these videos out of order up to this point largely, will then complete the Heraclian line. Recently, I made the decision to engage in a long-term project where I will make a video playlist talking about all of Byzantium's emperors. And that means that my focus on being a completionist will cause me to have to talk about a few people who really aren't very interesting. And here is the first of those videos, because I figure, hey, it's a good thing to get some of these out of the way and then move on to things that are more interesting. So I'm going to talk about Constantine III. And I'm going to talk about him for the one thing that he's famous for being Heraclius's heir apparent. This coin was minted when Constantine III was still a child and his father was still alive. You see the man and the boy with the crowns. So without any further ado, let's talk about what little there is to talk about regarding Constantine III. When Heraclius took power in 610, he was eager to establish a dynasty and not just be a one-off usurper like Phocas. He also saw that one of the problems that Phocas had as emperor was a lack of legitimacy, and that part of that lack of legitimacy stemmed from the fact that Phocas had no male heirs, and that he had to adopt Priscus, who, then of course contacted Heraclius' father asking for help. So wanting to avoid a sad middle age, Heraclius and his wife focused heavily on making children. In 612, Eudokia gave birth to a son who at the time was mostly called Heraclius Constantine, and this young man would then be crowned in 613 as a co-emperor. We know him as Constantine III, and we don't really know anything else about what he did in his life between being born, being crowned, and then his dad's death. But in 641, Heraclius died of exhaustion, and it's possible that Constantine III, during those last few years when his dad was back in the capital, was helping him run the state in some capacity. We don't really know. But he was 29 when his dad died, so about the same age his dad had been when he came to power. However, unlike Heraclius, who was vigorous and active and accomplished, it looks like Constantine had barely left the palace. He didn't have very good health, and so far as we know, he hadn't really achieved anything of note. I'm sure he had held a few honorary offices or titles, but he hadn't really done much else besides. Also, I'd like to point out that if you were to type in Constantine III in your browser looking for additional information, you would be very likely to run across the Western Roman Emperor Constantine III, who ruled from 407 to 411, but who was normally considered a usurper, so the Byzantine historical tradition did not really count him, and they considered Heraclius Constantine to be Constantine III. In case you're a little bit interested in the Western Constantine III, this is his coin to the right. In November of 641, Heraclius Novus Constantinus Augustus, or as we like to call him, Constantine III, took control as the senior ruler of the Byzantine Empire. He was not, as we'll see later, the sole ruler, but he was the senior ruler. And the first problem he faced is that his father left no money behind. The empire was broke. They had been fighting the Persians and then the Arabs for many years, so there really wasn't much to work with financially. And supposedly things were so bad that there's an apocryphal story that Constantine actually opened up his father's coffin and removed his crown, so that way he would have just a little bit of money. And I find that comparable to a story I heard on Horrible Histories, where George IV dug up a lot of his ancestors and was curious what they looked like. Anyway, I had to make this interesting and stretch it out a little bit. That's why I'm talking about George IV at random. Okay, so back to Constantine III. And of course, he obviously inherited some great foreign challenges, and he wasn't really able to face them because he only lived until May. One other fact about Constantine III is that he lost his mother at a young age, and that Heraclius remarried his niece named Martina and had a whole slew of other children. So Constantine III was not the only potential heir, and because Heraclius was worried about the fate of the children he had by Martina, he made Heraclius's half brother Heraclius co-emperor starting in the year 638. The coin to the right shows that there are three emperors on the coin. Two of them are supposed to be subordinates, and they all look like grown men. However, Heraclius at the time of that coin was maybe 11 or 12, since he was 15 at the time that their father died. Now, it was sort of understood both by Heraclius and by Martina, and presumably also by Constantine III, that Heraclius was really more of a stand-in for Martina, who was a very politically active empress, and that if there was going to be a rivalry for power and influence, it was going to be between the senior emperor Constantine III and the former empress Martina. However, it's also worth noting that we have no actual evidence that there was a real rivalry in place between Constantine III and then Martina and Heraclius. We have no real proof of that. Keep in mind that what ends up happening is that the son of Constantine III will go on to be emperor, and he will pass the throne to his son and grandson, and they will have their own view of what happened, and it will not necessarily be one favorable to the Martina branch of the Heraclean line. In May 641, after a long and glorious 3 months on the throne, Constantine III dropped dead without any warning. And most likely he died because of tuberculosis. It could have been because of poison, but it actually isn't all that likely. Now, regardless of how and why he died, suspicion for his death immediately fell upon Martina and Heraclius, who were already mistrusted since the public saw Heraclius and Martina's relationship as having been incestuous, and therefore Heraclius was more or less illegitimate in the eyes of many people. So a prominent general named Valentinus immediately demanded that the young Constans II be crowned to replace his father Constantine III. And then in September, there were rumors circulating that Martina was planning to eliminate Constans II to make way for Heraclius, and she was also looking to crown one of her younger sons by Heraclius, named either David or Tiberius, excuse me. And because of those rumors, the crowd stormed the palace, and they removed both Heraclius and Martina, and then forced them to be mutilated and live in exile. And that is what ultimately secured Constans II and his path towards remaining ruler. So this is what ensured that the bloodline of Constantine III continued and lived on, because after 3 months on the throne, you have a great legacy that has to be lived up to. So let's keep it real here. The main significance of Constantine III is that he was the son of Heraclius and the father of Constans II. In his own right, he really doesn't matter. I guess you could make the argument that he did manage to transmit legitimacy. Obviously, there were people who were loyal to his memory and his branch of the family that almost certainly had more to do with his father than with him, but maybe he had a bigger political role than is remembered. Maybe before he became ill, he had had a more active and interesting life. Certainly, we know that Constans II was 11 by the time that his father died, so maybe that implies that, in his late teens, early 20s, Constantine III was a much more active and imposing figure, and that he impressed people and did things and made political allies and all kinds of other stuff. However, we really don't know because we have almost no information about him. We do know that his grandson Constantine IV, pictured on the right in his coin, successfully defended Constantinople against an Arab siege. So that's a pretty big deal. And his great grandson is Justinian II, who's my favorite Byzantine emperor. So I guess he's got all that going for him. And his other legacy is that by dying suddenly, he managed to arouse a lot of suspicion against his co-emperor Heraclius and his stepmother Martina, and more or less doomed that branch of the family to obscurity and ensured that no one from that branch would ever hold imperial office. Next video, we're going to talk about Heraclius, and then we'll look at Martina, since she clearly figures very prominently in the history of this age. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for the video that you subscribe to this channel for. This is the moment when I talk about the greatest Byzantine emperor of all time, if not the greatest man to ever walk the face of the earth, the Emperor Heraclius. And I'm calling him the Byzantine King Tut because, just like King Tut, he's someone who died as a teenager, didn't actually accomplish anything, and about whom we don't really know anything. So let's get this party started. Let's talk about Heraclius and his life and reign. After the death of his first wife, Heraclius remarried Martina, his niece, and this proved to be a fruitful union as well as what seems like a loving marriage. They produced 10 children. However, because of the incest involved, most of these children were impaired either mentally or physically and were considered unfit to rule. In this time period, any kind of noticeable physical handicap would be considered grounds of ineligibility because it would show that God did not love you. Heraclius seems to have been the only viable male to have reached adulthood out of this entire group of children, which made him special. Now, he also was just at the cusp of adulthood when his father died in February of 641, and he had actually been made co-emperor in order to protect the interest of his half of the family in the year 638. So technically, he had already been in power for 3 years when his father died. Heraclius is actually a diminutive for Heraclius, and it just means little Heraclius. His full name is actually Flavius Constantinus Heraclius, but in all of the surviving literature about him, he is simply called Heraclius. Now, as I mentioned earlier, he was made emperor to protect his half of the family's interest, so the children of Martina would have a champion in Heraclius. However, one of the sons of the first marriage, Constantine III, was clearly the senior partner in government. He was 29 at the time as opposed to 15, and it was clear that Constantine III was supposed to be the guy in charge. So far as we know, Heraclius never got a chance to assert himself because he was too young, and in the sources, which are admittedly hostile, he's portrayed simply as a puppet for his mother Martina and her overweening political ambitions. Now, this could simply be a form of abuse, since it was usually an accusation against women if they were considered ambitious, and that was sort of a character assassination attempt. And by talking about Martina being ambitious, that then made Heraclius sort of a puppet, and it kind of also would make him seem dishonorable and like someone who was a waste of time. There also was a bias against Heraclius and Martina because Martina was engaged in an incestuous marriage and Heraclius was the product of that union. So keep in mind that everything that we know about Heraclius, which is admittedly little, is biased against him, and it also is a bias which has a clear agenda, since it is trying to justify the fact that Heraclius was deposed and never got a chance to rule as emperor. So the main problem for Heraclius actually ended up being the death of his brother. Now you might think that losing your elder half-brother and then inheriting the whole of the imperial authority would not necessarily be a horrible thing, but in the case of Heraclius, because of the incestuous relationship that he was produced by, there was always a stigma against him ruling. And when his elder brother died fairly suddenly, most likely of TB, but possibly because of poisoning, it really outraged public opinion and caused there to be a backlash against Heraclius and his mother. General Valentinus basically stormed the palace and then demanded that Constantine III's young son, the nephew of Heraclius, Constans II, be accepted as an imperial colleague. That was done, and it looked like everything was going to be okay. But then we get to September, and now Martina wants to change the balance of power a little bit in the favor of herself and her branch of the family. So she tries to crown her younger son as Caesar, and that son would have been about the same age as Constans II. And this really sparks a lot of resentment because the supporters of the main line of the Heraclean dynasty now see Martina and her son Heraclius as really trying to eliminate that branch, or at least, bury its influence under by crowning as many people as possible. So when the rumors start to circulate that Heraclius and his mom are trying to actually plot against Constans II and his life, this leads to them being deposed. And then things get really interesting for Heraclius once he gets deposed from office. The one undying claim to fame that Heraclius had, and the only reason that he would ever be mentioned in a trivia game, is that he was the first victim of judicial mutilation. Now, what is judicial mutilation? The idea is stemming from what I was talking about earlier, where if you have a severe physical deformation, you're not allowed to hold imperial office. Well, one way to prevent someone from resuming their imperial office, if you wanted to get rid of them without killing them, because killing them can be impious, especially if there's someone who's an emperor, well, you have the option of physically mutilating them so that they are now, not whole, and they're just not someone who would be acceptable as emperor. So this is what is done to Heraclius and his mother Martina. So both of them are mutilated in different ways. Heraclius has his nose slit. It probably looks something like the drawing on the left, where you see that the nose holes are way too big. So most likely they just cut off the end of his nose and gave it a deformed look. It most likely would not have necessarily been something that would have been truly debilitating. It would just been aesthetically unpleasing. His mother Martina had her tongue cut off, most likely because she was a woman who had political ambitions, and therefore, in the eyes of a male-dominated society like Byzantium, she was more or less evil and degenerate. This is the first ever practice of this. Later, after Justinian II, who is pictured on the left, figured out that he could still rule with a prosthetic nose, future emperors who would be deposed and mutilated would be blinded rather than having their nose clipped or their tongue clipped. Because if you're blind, you definitely can't rule. You have to be literate and able to command troops and all that kind of stuff to be an emperor, and that's just something a blind person simply can't do, at least with the technology of the pre-modern world. Heraclius and his mother were exiled to Rhodes after they were mutilated, and we actually think that Heraclius was dead before the year was out. Maybe he was deeply depressed, maybe his nose was clipped more severely than Justinian II's was later. We don't really know. And it's also believed that Martina didn't really last all that much longer after her son, the former emperor, had died. So, kind of a sad ending for Heraclius, but at least he was a pioneer. So, there's always that. In two of my recent videos, I talked about Constantine III and Heraclius, the immediate successors to Heraclius. Well, today I felt like it would only be fair if I mentioned another major player in that saga, the Empress Martina. Generally speaking, I don't plan on covering most empresses, since most of them did not actually exercise political power. However, in the case of Martina, she clearly was someone with extraordinary influence, and someone who is pretty interesting in her own right. So, let's talk about Martina. One thing you'll notice is that one of the surviving coins for her is in really terrible shape here, and this was not a high denomination coin. and that kind of gives you sort of an idea of the status of imperial women vis-a-vis imperial men. When Heraclius first became emperor in 610, he was married to his wife Favia, who took the title Eudokia. In 613, or maybe even 612, she died, and then Heraclius decided he needed to remarry and make sure that he had more than one heir. So he decided to marry his niece Martina, and this marriage, which was considered incest by many in that society, would ultimately both make Martina a powerful figure and then later cause her downfall. So, legally speaking, if you're looking at Roman law, marriage between an uncle and a niece was accepted, and that ruling had been as recent as the Theodosian Code under Theodosius II, and I think it had been reconfirmed by Justinian's Code. However, there was a council at Chalcedon which had also had a ruling about incest, and in that case they did not accept marriages from people this close together. So there was a conflict of interest here, and sort of secular and sacred laws had not quite been worked out in the sense of deciding which would have jurisdiction when and where. So in this case, while there was doubt, the doubt fell on the side of a powerful person, and Heraclius was able to rely on civil law to get his will. Heraclius' decision was opposed even by a lot of people very close to him, his brother Theodore and the patriarch Sergius, who played such a big role in his career. Both had pretty strong misgivings, but ultimately they went along with it because they were loyal to the emperor. And it looks like, from all accounts, that Heraclius and Martina had a long and successful partnership, and that they were extremely close on an emotional level. So, apparently he chose his wife well, at least in that regard. He chose someone who proved to be a good partner for him, and someone who was able to give him reliable advice and emotional support. One of Heraclius' claims to fame was being only the second emperor in 3 centuries to campaign in person. And more interesting than that, arguably, is the fact that he took his wife Martina along with him. Many people have interpreted this as that being a sign that the two of them were very close, and I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption. Also, Heraclius was very interested in siring as many heirs as possible to really cement his legitimacy, so that was probably also a factor. She was clearly able to get pregnant more easily if she was nearby rather than being in Constantinople. So this campaign, of course, began in 622 and continued until 627 or 8. And they apparently spent a lot of time in the east even after that. Heraclius went to the capital and then returned to the east, and he was present at Antioch. And we have at least one source declaring that she was there by his side when Heraclius received the news about the Battle of Yarmouk, where the Arabs won a massive victory against the Byzantine army. From what we can gather from this information and from other things, it looks like there was a great deal of trust between the imperial couple, and that she was called upon to give advice and not just comfort and companionship. So, as with many marriages between people who are too closely related, there were some viability issues with the offspring that Heraclius and Martina had. Now, by the time that she gave birth to Heraclonus in 626 or so, she had already had several childbirths, and all of the males from that marriage had been people who suffered from either mental or physical defects. In Byzantium, you were only considered eligible for the throne if you were free of any obvious ailments, because a lot of ailments such as, say, dwarfism, that's why I put Tyrion on here, or maybe even something like a cleft palate or a bad limp, all of these things were considered to be a sort of judgment from God, either against the parents, against the offspring, or maybe just a simple sign from God that this person was not intended to rule, even if it's not necessarily a moral judgment against them. And because this kept happening to the imperial couple, and many of their children suffered from this, a lot of people began to openly wonder about the piety of Heraclius and Martina, And you combine that with the kind of political and military setbacks that Heraclius suffered, and there were a lot of people who really wondered if God was passing judgment on Heraclius and finding him unworthy in some way. As Heraclius began to get older and more sickly, Martina began to try to take steps to ensure the survival of her children and ensure her own place going forward after Heraclius' eventual death and the accession of his son by his first marriage. So in 638, she was able to convince Heraclius to elevate Heraclius to the rank of Augustus alongside his elder half-brother Constantine III. Many people, at least in the sources, tend to think that what was happening is that Martina was actually the power behind the throne for Heraclius, and that she was using him as a puppet, and that she was actually intending to run the show. However, we actually don't really know if that was the case. It is possible, given what happened later, that this was a sort of propaganda effort on behalf of the descendants of Constantine III to smear Martina and to smear Heraclius by extension, and we'll look at the reasons why that might be the case right now. So why would portraying Martina as a puppet master be a way to smear her? Well, in the ancient and medieval world, this was very much a man's society, and any woman who was ambitious or sought to exercise power either in her own name or in any kind of de facto way was seen as being, somewhat evil. And the natural way to smear a female who was ambitious was to attack her character, and the way to do that was to accuse her of sexual misconduct. The reason for that is that the sexual chastity of women in this period was considered very important, because if they were considered at all promiscuous, then the legitimacy of their children would be called into question. Keep in mind, there was no Maury show or any paternity testing available in order to figure out who the father was. So you basically had to rely on the wife's word, and one way to really smear an opponent is to suggest that his children were by a different man, and that was a true fact for all of antiquity. And in a way, that's kind of what they do by portraying her as illegitimate and by emphasizing the incestuous nature of her relationship with her husband. And for whatever reason, while this stigma does seem to have attached itself to Heraclius to some degree, Martina was really the person who really received the brunt of the abuse. I mean, I guess maybe it's because Heraclius won the Battle of Nineveh and Martina didn't, but at any rate, there was a double standard for sexual conduct in the ancient world, and ultimately this would be something that would really cost Martina dearly. I'm now going to briefly summarize the events of February to September of 641. If you want to see this in more depth, I recommend checking out my videos on Constantine III and Heraclius, where I also go over this. So basically what happens is Heraclius dies, and then we have the co-emperors Constantine III and Heraclius, and then Constantine III dies in May. It looks like he died of natural causes. He was not well even when he ascended to the throne. And, however, Martina was then accused of poisoning him in order to promote Heraclius and her branch of the family. So there was a demand that Constantine's son, Constans II, who was then age 11, be given a crown. So that was done, and things looked like they were stable and ready to continue. But then there were rumors abounding that Martina and Heraclius were plotting against Constans II's life. So the partisans of that branch of the family and people who still thought that, Martina and her marriage to Heraclius were an abomination, basically forced her and her son out of office. And rather than killing them, since they couldn't prove a crime, what they did was make them ineligible for imperial office. Remember what I said earlier, if you had a physical or mental deformity, you were not allowed to hold imperial power. Well, neither Martina nor her son Heraclius had any such disability, so the people deposing them decided to give them one. And this is the introduction of judicial mutilation. So what happens is that Martina had her tongue cut off while Heracleonis' nose was slit, and then in September, after they're deposed, they're exiled to Rhodes, the island of Rhodes, excuse me. And it looks like Heracleonis died within the year, and we don't know exactly when Martina died, but it's not unreasonable to think that it wasn't all that long thereafter. And this practice would eventually evolve to become one where they would blind the victim. That way, that person would be unable to really function and exercise any kind of meaningful power. And the reason they had to do that was because of a guy named Justinian II, who is really interesting. Anyway, that is my spiel about Martina. I think she's one of the more interesting empresses. Let me know what you think, and we'll come back with more content soon.